Hello, I'm Frances from Homestead, and I'm ready to plant my tomatoes. I'm ready to transplant my tomato plants. Now, I had intended to plant them on the 1st of June. Unfortunately, I was traveling in Puerto Rico, and I got home after midnight on the 1st. And it's been a busy week since I got back. The tomatoes are way too big. I should have transplanted them before I left, but there was so many things to do to get ready to go, and I didn't get it done. So now I've got these really big tomato plants to transplant, which they'll be fine because you plant them real deep to give the stem a lot of contact to the soil so that it develops a nice strong root system. So that part will be fine. However, I mentioned in a previous episode that the idea for the greenhouse was to put the tomatoes in it. Unfortunately, last week was so hot, and the greenhouse without windows or shade cloth would have killed those tomatoes right away. And we're still trying to figure out how to put in windows without causing permanent damage. And the other problem is the shade cloth. It's going to be a little bit of money, and I needed to save that up. And then once I got that saved up, then it was going to be weeks before it could be delivered. And by that time, it will be a month past the time to get them put in instead of just a week. So I've decided I'm not going to be putting my tomatoes in the greenhouse. And unfortunately, the greenhouse probably won't get used this summer. The hope was to use it in the spring, possibly over the winter, for sure in the fall, for some early spring planting and some late fall planting. So that's what we'll hope for. Since we didn't get it in the spring, we'll do it in the fall. However, for now, I'm going to be putting my tomatoes in random locations throughout the yard. And I'm going to start with my grow beds. Now, I've already pulled up the radishes out of this root vegetable grow bed because they had fully germinated, and I used what I could. Then they went to seed, and so I gave the rest to the chickens. They loved that. I also, in my squash grow bed, some of my squash didn't come up, so I'm going to put some tomato plants there. Now, I've decided to put my cherry tomatoes in the grow beds. My Amish paste and my Jet Star slicers I'm going to be putting in the ground where I had my corn last year. Now, this is not prepared. It's going to take us a full day, I'm sure, to get the space ready, but we've got to get it done and get them in the ground. So that's what we're going to be doing, getting all the tomato plants put in the ground. So let's get started. Well, turns out I had 4 red cherry tomato plants. And they were so delicious, I can't bring myself to getting rid of any of them. So I'm going to go ahead and plant them, and they'll be a little close, but I think they'll be okay because I tie them up pretty good. I do the Florida weave. That's what was taught to me, and it works pretty good. Now the idea is to go as deep as I can with this. As you can see, they grew very tall in the grow room, but it's got a real sturdy root system, and it's not too bound up. I don't see, it's not wrapped around 20 million times. The ends are really close and accessible. I want to spread it out just a little bit so that way they don't keep going around in a circle. They'll start growing down and out. I'm going to take the bottom ones off. And this one is almost touching the ground, but we'll leave it for now. I have a tomato plant food recipe that I got from the YouTube channel Appalachia's Homestead with Patera. And it has wood ash and Epsom salts, eggshells, bone meal, powdered milk, and baking soda. And it also called for compost, but this bed is all compost. I'm just supposed to mix it in with the soil that I'm putting back in the hole with the tomato. So I'll just be adding it to the compost that I'm putting in. I'm supposed to do 2 tablespoons in each hole. I'm going to put a little bit of the compost and mix with that. And then I'm going to water into the hole. And now I'll put the rest of the compost back on top. There, that's lovely. Now once that I get all of these planted, I'm going to put posts and weave the string. I'm doing about 18 inches apart. I'm getting down to the hugelkultur. I better stop digging. Okay, there's my red cherry tomatoes. I'm very excited to have these in the ground. I'm going to get these tied up and get a drip system on them, and they'll be good to go. Now I'm going to get the yellow cherry tomatoes planted. I miscounted those also. I have 3 of those. So I fortunately have space for 3 of them over here in the squash bed. Now this bed has our homemade compost from this year, not the store-bought compost that I had in the other grow boxes from last year. So it's not as beautifully black and fluffy as the other one, and it has a lot more of our native sand, but it's been growing things pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and put them in the ground and hope for the best. I already have the drip set up here, so I'm going to put this one right where this emitter is. So we don't want any of the leaves to be touching the ground. So I've pulled off any that were reaching down. And if these continue to grow down, I'll take those off as well. Now this one's reaching way down to the ground, so I'm going to take this one off also. This is a sucker, so I'm going to take that one off, as well as the one below it. And then we'll tie it up. They were growing for so long, they just have been falling over. Okay, we got the cherry tomatoes in the ground. Now it's time to do the Amish paste and the Jet Star. That is going to be a bigger process. Okay, so this is the location where I'm going to be putting my tomatoes. Now, I did have some corn here last year. They did not do very well. And of course, it's all sand. So I have a bit more weeding to do. I'm going to take a hula hoe to it. And then I'm going to be using the last of my aged manure pile, and we're going to move the whole thing over here. Now I've thought about tilling it in. I've thought about just laying it on top. I mean, it is all sand, so I'm trying to figure out the best way to help my tomatoes grow. I don't expect that they're going to grow that great in sand. I generally, when I'm planting directly in sand, I'll dig a hole, take the sand out, have a hole in the sand, and then I'd fill that with the compost and plant the plant inside the compost. And the compost is usually mixed with some of the sand so that there's a bit of a transition as their roots grow out into the sand. The only problem with that is I want to put down a woven weed cloth on top of the ground where the tomatoes plants are going to be. But in the meantime, I want to get this ground prepared and get the pile of aged manure over here and see what we come up with, I guess. So let's get started. We're bringing in gorilla cart loads of the aged manure from up above the chicken coop where we have a couple truckloads that we've been working on, and it's come down to a small pile, so we're going to finish it off here where we're planting the tomato plants. Okay, my battery died, so we got some things done off camera. As you can see, we've driven some posts all the way down both rows, and I have piled up the aged manure mixed with the sand and made a trench down the middle. And so far I have one side of the weed barrier cloth, and then I will put it down the middle and also on this side. But I'm not going to put any more weed barrier cloth until I get the plants in the ground. I'm actually going to be planting in between where the weed barrier cloth meets. I cut a 4-foot row in half so that I have 2 feet on one side, 4 feet in between the two rows, and then another 2 feet on the outside. I'm going to be placing the plants in between where the weed barrier cloth meets. I'm not going to be burning holes in it because I have a unique situation with these tomatoes. My tomato plants are very leggy. They were getting really large in the grow room, and since we didn't have the greenhouse ready, we just moved them down to the floor, and so then they just kept stretching up to the light. So I'm going to be laying them down in this position, like this, so that way I don't have to dig 2-foot holes to put them down in the ground, because I'm going to want them to be buried up about here. This would be a very deep hole. So I've seen in other YouTube channels where they place them sideways and lay them down, and so that's what I'm going to be doing with these. And since I'm putting them 2 feet apart, that gives me plenty of room to be able to do that. And it makes it so that I can put them in the aged manure where it's closer to the top, so they get more nutrients rather than being down 2 foot into the sand. So let's get started. I've got one, and we'll keep going. I've also added compost to the tomato food, so that way, since I don't have very good compost in this soil, it's not too concentrated. I'm going to leave the leaves in the trench just for amendment. Now, truthfully, this is not the best soil to be planting in. Unfortunately, we're at the end of the aged compost, and a lot of it is pretty hard and clumpy. And if I had the water available, I would soak it and it would be amazing, and stir it up with some sand. And anyway, I'm making do with what I have, and I'm hoping that it will all work out, and we will try it and see. It's obviously getting too dark to work. It's obviously getting too dark for the camera, but I'm going to keep going because I need to get this finished, and we'll come back in the morning. Okay, it's the next morning, and it rained. I am so excited about that. It's such a relief when things get watered on their own. Oh my goodness. I'm not worried about my vegetables. I'm not worried about my flowers or herbs. It's just wonderful. And of course, my tomatoes are still in the process of getting planted. I was not able to finish. It got too dark last night, so we're back at it this morning. The Jet Star are almost done, and I have the Amish paste laid out, so hopefully we'll make quick work of this. And then I will be able to lay down the weed barrier fabric, get that stapled in, and then I'll set up the drip. So still a little ways to go. It's raining again, so I'm going to get my camera out of the rain and I'll show you when it's all done how it's turned out. It's been sprinkling all morning, so it's really been wonderful having that moisture and the cloud cover to finish the planting of the tomatoes. And I've got them all in. Now, everything in this row here is the Jet Star, and they're supposed to be a beautiful, large, uniform-sized slicer tomato, and I'm really looking forward to trying those out. And then in this row over here, the first 10 are the Amish paste, and I've never done Amish paste, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that's going to work out. And then at the very end over here of this row is something called Triple Crop. And it was just a package of tomato seed that was given to me with my flower order from Burgess. And so I went ahead and planted a few seeds to give it a try and see how they are. They're supposed to be a very high producing type of tomato. As you can see, they're more of a potato type leaf. I did some German pinks last year that were potato type leaf tomato plant. So all 3 of these I've never tried before. So it'll be a new experience with these particular tomato plants and tomatoes. But I chose them in the hopes that I will have better production. That's my hope. And I have the ground cover. I have the weed barrier cloth down. I'll probably put straw, or if I ever get the wood chipper back, I'll put wood chips. But it's just so that I have less weeding to do. I don't hate weeding, and I don't mind keeping an eye on the gap between the weed barrier cloth where the plants are. And it was easier for me to plant them, not having to go through a little tiny hole burned in the weed barrier cloth. And I also plan to put some basil. I already have some basil that I started in the grow room, and I want to put that in between some of the tomato plants as a companion plant. Now I still plan to do drip. Unfortunately, I've gone twice to Home Depot and they do not have in stock, where I bought before, the 1/4-inch tubing with the 12-inch emitters. So I'm going to look online and see if I can find it, because that's what I want to be able to put here on the tomatoes. And I'm not going to be running string on the posts yet because I put them in the ground pretty far. So it'll probably be a little while before I need to run string to tie them up. But I had the posts put in the ground so that way I don't have to worry about driving posts after I have plants. I don't want to be disturbing the roots. But for now, I'm all done planting. It's taken a little time, but I'll be so grateful when they start producing. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'm so grateful for you. Until we meet again.